Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining me today on our first digital lunch and learn. I'm so excited that you all took the time to come and learn a little bit more about the macroinvertebrates of our streams, and I'm really jazzed that you're all here. So I'm Lauren McGrath. I'm the director of the Watershed Protection program, and I am an aquatic ecologist, which means I study all of the different components in a stream, but I am the most passionate about the stream insects, which is what I'm here to talk to you about today. So before we get too far into the lecture, I want to take a moment to really delve into what even is a macroinvertebrate. So macroinvertebrate, very simply, is an animal without a backbone that's large enough to be seen with the naked eye. And they live all or part of their lives in a water body. So aquatic macroinvertebrates can include things like gastropods, which are snails, bivalves, which can be clams and mussels, crustaceans, which includes crayfish, and insects, both in their adult and larval forms. For the purpose of today's talk, we're really going to be focusing just on the insect portion of the discussion. And just so you're aware, this will have lots of images of different kinds of stream insects, including this beauty that's currently on the screen. This is actually the larval form of a dragonfly, a skimmer. So you can see already that the larval form of many of our insects do not look remotely similar to the common terrestrial adult forms that we're used to. So it's pretty impressive, I think, to see the kind of changes that can take place. And really, I think it's fascinating to start to familiarize ourselves with some of these more alien members of our stream communities. So something that's important to keep in your mind while we're talking about stream insects is the role that they play in our streams. And that role varies depending on where in the stream you are. So there's this fantastic concept, the river continuum concept, that really helps us to get a better understanding of the way our streams function. So it's a model for describing how flowing water conditions can be predictive of the organisms that live within our stream reaches. So at the top of this diagram, that signifies the start of a stream. So it could be where a spring and groundwater meets the surface, providing the start of our waterway. And as we look from our small headwater streams, which is very similar to where Willistown Conservation Trust program area is located, we see that we have different community structures of our insects. So in the very small headwater streams, we have a lot of shredders and collectors with very few of these kind of grazer community structure. And then as we move downstream, we see that proportion starts to switch, where we see many more grazers and fewer shredders. And that is really important to keep in mind, because this structure is not just predictive of our area, but it's predictive of all streams around the world. So this river continuum concept really gives the basis for understanding how our aquatic ecosystems function if you're in southeastern Pennsylvania or if you're in Bangladesh. So it's a really amazing tool, and it's very helpful, especially when we stop to really think about rivers and streams and flowing waters in Chester County or in Pennsylvania or in the United States. There's a huge amount of waterways in our country and in our world. And it's so important that we start to think about where we are, and we think about our location in a lot of different ways, right? We think about in our community, in our township, maybe in our state or our county. But now I want to challenge you to start to think about where you are in your watershed. Do you know what watershed you're in right now? I know that I'm in Ridley Creek watershed, which feeds into the Delaware River. So I know that all of the water here is going to end up in the Atlantic, probably in a couple of weeks, which is exciting. And it's important to always remember, no matter where you are in the world, you're in a watershed. And every action you take on land is going to be reflected in the waterways around you. And so it's, I want to challenge you to start thinking about where you are, where your play space is, from a watershed perspective instead of just a terrestrial perspective, which is how we're trained to think. So I'm going to start this with a very silly phrase: trout grow on trees. This is a really important phrase, and it's not to be taken literally. We don't have orchards of trout trees somewhere in the United States. Rather, it's a way of quickly explaining trophic levels. So fish depend on the carbon input from trees to feed all of the insects and smaller fish that they feed on. So how does this happen? How can a leaf be transformed into a fish? Let's look at our beautiful, pristine headwater stream as an example. So here we have a brook trout, which is the only native trout to Pennsylvania, and it is in fact our state fish. And on the banks of our beautiful stream, we have an old oak tree that's just dropped a leaf into our waterway. This leaf by itself, raw, is not particularly delicious. I think of it kind of like eating a raw leaf of Swiss chard. It's just not for me. It's not for a lot of insects either. So before we can feed our leaf to any of the other higher order organisms, we have to condition it. So right after a leaf falls into the water, it gets coated with a biofilm, which is an amalgamation of bacteria and fungi and diatoms and algae. And it starts to condition and break down the leaf to make it more nutritious and delicious for our stream insects. So the biofilm builds up on our leaf from our oak tree. And very quickly, we start to see organisms being drawn to the leaf. So our herbivorous sect of our insect community is built up primarily of shredders and scrapers. Shredders eat the leaf itself, and they break down the carbon directly, and the scrapers eat the biofilm off of the leaf. So it's important, I want to highlight the fact that this organism here, this stonefly, is not a shredder for its entire life. And over the course of its lifespan, it'll shift from being a shredder to a predator as it gets larger. And our scraper here is denoted by a beautiful mayfly. I think it's beautiful. You're going to hear me say bugs are beautiful a lot, and I hope you understand that that's just where I'm coming from. So downstream of our very messy eaters are our collectors. So these are some of the smartest insects, in my opinion, in the stream. They hang out below, in the current below, the shredders who are breaking down leaf packs in our waterways and collect the detritus that floats by. So this is a caddisfly. We'll be talking a lot about caddisflies today. They build these awesome cases and webs, and they're really, really important for their health of our waterways. Whenever you have a lot of herbivores, you're going to have your predators. And this predator is the amazing hellgrammite. We don't have too many of them around here, but they are present. And hellgrammites turn into dobson flies, alder flies, and fish flies. So if you're an angler, you may have encountered these before. They make fantastic bait. They're very feisty on the hook. More commonly in our area, we see dragonflies and damselflies being the apex predators in our macroinvertebrate community. So dragonflies and damselflies are some of the most spectacularly adapted insects in our waterways. You can see here, he's eating, I believe this is a stonefly. And this appendage right below his mouth isn't an extra set of arms, it's actually a jaw that sits below the mouth, and then it extends out up to a third of the length of the insect's body. And it does it in the blink of an eye. They're incredibly fast. And he also has a jet propulsion system, meaning that he can go from 0 to 60 in no seconds flat. So this is an ambush predator, and they're really, really common. They're the #1 aquatic predator globally. And we have a robust community of different dragonflies and damselflies. So aside from them just being fantastically fascinating, why are we studying macroinvertebrates? It's really important because they can tell us an amazingly detailed story about water quality in our stream systems. These organisms live in the stream all year long, and they can give us a longer-term picture of the conditions in our streams than water chemistry can. So we like to pair biological monitoring processes, so like macroinvertebrates or fishes, with a chemical analysis, which we do on a monthly basis. But when you do a chemistry analysis, you go into the ever-changing stream and you grab a sample from it, and you get a snapshot of that one moment in time, what the conditions were. But when we're starting to look at these insects, like the stonefly on the screen, this is a very sensitive species, and it can live over 18 months, between 18 months and 2 years in a waterway. And so if we see a large, robust stonefly, like this beautiful Perlidae, it tells us that we have maintained high enough water quality over the course of the year that it's been alive. And so that gives us a little bit more depth of understanding to our water chemistry data. And also, I failed to mention this at the beginning, but if you have any questions, please fill them into the chat function at the bottom of the screen. We'll be addressing all of your thoughts and questions at the end of the talk. So we have a pretty solid understanding of the sensitivities of different groups of organisms. So when we are out in the stream and analyzing our samples, we're trying to get a better understanding of who's there and who's not. If you find a stream that has a lot of these group 1 insects, these are really sensitive. They're intolerant of pollution. They can't handle a lot of change. These are great to see. The big 3 in this group are the stoneflies, mayflies, and caddisflies. These are the 3 that we are always looking for in our waterways to get a better understanding of how it's functioning. In our sensitive group also includes riffle beetles, which live both their juvenile and their adult form in the stream, and water pennies, which are a beautiful type of beetle. They're really gorgeous to see under the microscope. And of course, our dobson flies, who are incredibly finicky. But as soon as you get a disturbance, say it gets really hot and like a pulse of hot water comes through, you lose those insects. So oftentimes you can go into a stream that looks healthy, it looks fine, but you're only really finding like damselflies and dragonflies, maybe some crane flies and clams or mussels. And this signifies that you've lost that sensitive, highly diverse group 1, and something might have happened in your stream. It's also not uncommon to lose group 2, and you're left with group 3 and group 4, who are pretty sturdy insects. They can withstand a lot of abuse, and they do withstand a lot of abuse. Things like midges, planaria or flatworms, and black fly larvae and leeches are really robust, and they can handle a lot of these changes that many of the other stream insects can't. It's interesting that many of these insects are also, these tolerant insects are considered pests, like black flies and biting midges. So it's important to keep them in balance with the diversity of group 1 and group 2. If you find a stream that only has group 4, so things like aquatic worms, springtails or rat-tailed maggots, and bloodworms, something devastating has happened to your stream and has happened long enough to get rid of all of those other more tolerant organisms. So this is a big red flag if you find a stream that only has these incredibly robust insects. So let's take a closer look at our big 3, right? Our mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies, or Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, and Trichoptera. These are our highly sensitive indicator species, and they're considered the canary in the coal mine. And if you're not familiar with that phrase, it's a throwback to when miners had unsafe working conditions, and they would bring a caged canary with them down into the mines. And if the canary stopped singing, it was an indication that it was unsafe to be in the mines, because canaries are more sensitive to oxygen levels than humans are. So when the canary stops singing, it's time to go. If our mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies have disappeared, it's a sign that something is going wrong, and it's time to take action to correct it before you lose any more diversity. There's a well-established relationship between water quality and the sensitivity of these organisms. And thanks to their old age, mayflies and stoneflies were two of the first organisms to colonize aquatic streams from the primordial ooze many millions of years ago. They exist on every continent of the world. They used to exist in Antarctica, but unfortunately it's frozen and they don't do well in the frost. So they exist everywhere around the world. And because of that, it gives us a strong basis to be able to make comparisons between our basin here in southeastern Pennsylvania and maybe in the Mississippi or in Bhutan. So it's really important to have this kind of litmus test for how healthy our stream is doing and how our biological community is responding to changes on the planet. So how do we make this assessment? You can go out and look at bugs all day long, but how are you able to standardize your inquiry into your stream health to make comparisons between different streams? My particular favorite analysis is called the MOS score. It's the Macroinvertebrate Aggregated Index for Streams. And the MOS score is a conglomerate of 10 different statistical analyses, and it's a really robust score. But for all clarity, there's probably 24 different ways you can analyze your stream health using your macroinvertebrates. This is just one that makes a great example. So if you go out, you collect your insects, you do your analysis, and you calculate your MOS index, your MOS score. If you get a score over 13.1, that's a sign that your diversity is mostly intact. You have a healthy stream, all of your canaries are singing away. However, if you fall below that 13.1 threshold, that's an indication that you've lost around 50% of your diversity. So that means you've lost a lot of your canaries. You might not be seeing some of your mayflies, stoneflies, or caddisflies anymore. And it's an indication that something has gone wrong upstream of your sample location, and you might want to investigate what's happening and see if you can make any corrections to restore your strongly diverse community. If it falls below 6, that is a 90% loss of diversity. Your stream has been traumatized. You really need to figure out what's happening, if there is any way to restore your community, because you're working with a very degraded system. So the MOS score can tell you so much, and this is just with presence and absence of different species. And it tells an amazing story about what's happening by looking at a small number of individuals, and small in this case means between 250 and 300 insects. It can really highlight a lot of issues that you might be missing when you're only looking at your water quality from a chemistry perspective. So there's a variety of different methods to go out and collect samples, but they're all similar in the fact that you put your net so the water flows through it, and then you disturb upstream to get all of those insects who are clinging to rocks and detritus to let go and flow into your net. And then you can go and look to see who's present and who's absent. So we use, in my experience, in my lab, we tend to use the Cerber sampler. So this is my team from last year, Maddie Sabo and Casey Rittenauer from Drexel University. They came out and did an incredible job collecting and analyzing samples with me. And everyone agrees that collecting the bugs is possibly more fun than actually analyzing them. I don't know if I'm completely on board with that yet, but it is a lot of fun to be out in the field and to be seeing and experiencing firsthand the stream in which these organisms are living in. So now we're going to take a little bit of a dive into how to identify mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies. But I want to take a second and offer this amazing resource. It's called macroinvertebrates.org, and it's a collaborative effort between Stroudwater Research Center and the Carnegie Institute to create an atlas of high quality images to assist in the kind of exploration of macroinvertebrates. If you are really interested in these insects, I encourage you to go look because there's a huge diversity. I could spend days talking to you about all of these different orders, but we're just going to focus on 3 for now. And the first are the mayflies, order Ephemeroptera. So mayflies are really pretty easy to identify. There's 3 main things you want to look for. They have abdominal gills, 2 to 3 tails. So this middle tail can sometimes be very small. So it'll just look like they have 2 tails, but it's important to check to see if they've got those abdominal gills. And if you have a microscope or a hand lens, you can check to see how many claws are at the end of each leg. Mayflies will always have 1 claw at the end of each leg. So that's the 1 claw, abdominal gills, 2 to 3 tails. That's a mayfly. And so this is an amazing example. The flat-headed mayflies are some of my favorites. They cling to rocks. So if you're looking for them in a stream and you pick up a rock, you might see something kind of moving around, but they stop pretty quickly and they're so beautifully camouflaged, they can be hard to find. So if you're out looking and you spot something wiggling around on a rock, check to see if it's got those abdominal gills and the 2 to 3 caudal filaments. And they go through a pretty intense transformation. So this is the larval form, right? They're youthful, they're young, and then they have their adult form. And so everyone's familiar with this idea that mayflies live for a day, right? They have 24 to maybe 48 hours to figure out how their wings work, figure out what a partner looks like, how to mate and lay their eggs. But they're easy to identify in their adult form too. They have 2 to 3 caudal filaments, so those 2 to 3 tails stay in their adult form. The 3rd tail in this image is very, very small. It's almost vestigial. And they hold their wings in an upright position on their back, like a butterfly. And there is a ton of diversity in this order. This is still a mayfly, but it's completely different. This is a burrowing mayfly, but if we look, it has 3 tails, abdominal gills, and it's hard to see, but I promise there's 1 single claw at the end of each of these legs. And so this mayfly is, as its name suggests, it burrows into soft sandy substrate. And so these organisms have been occupying these niches for a very long time, giving them the evolutionary time needed to really develop all of the adaptations they need to perfectly exploit the resources that are available. And burrowing mayflies turn into these gorgeous adults. They have really striking coloration and they can be fairly large. But again, 2 to 3 tails and wings held upright like a butterfly. And then this is one of my favorites, just highlighting again the diversity of the insects. And this is a picture taken in the field. This is in Crum Creek, but you can see the abdominal gills and the 3 tails with your naked eye. Those 2 things are usually enough to identify a mayfly from a stonefly. But this brush-legged mayfly is one of my favorites. It's one of the best dressed insects, I think. It has this beautiful fringe on its front 2 legs that it uses for kind of filtering water as it passes to feed itself. All right, so now we're going to move on to the stonefly. It does not have abdominal gills. It only has 2 tails. And then it definitely has more than 1 claw on at the ends of its legs. So 2 tails, 2 claws, no abdominal gills. The gills are super varied on stoneflies depending on the family. And perlids keep their gills tucked into their armpits. And when they get stressed out and oxygen levels drop, they start doing rapid push-ups to try and increase the amount of water flowing over their gills. Stoneflies, when they turn into their adult form, keep their same head shape. They look very similar in the face as adults as they do when they're young. And they keep their wings flat on their back. So think of a moth versus a butterfly. And they always only have 2 tails. And then that brings us to my very favorite, the caddisfly. So caddisflies look very different than mayflies and stoneflies. But the important thing to look for is that they have this gigantic hook on their rear end, and that helps them stay grounded. This is a net spinning caddisfly. And caddisflies have 6 legs in their larval form, and then hooks on their back end. So caddisflies are special because they spin silk. They're closely related to the Lepidoptera, which are butterflies and moths. And they use their silk to create cases. And they're really, really clever builders. So depending on the organism, they might use some leaves that they trim down to size or branches. This insect tends to just make a hodgepodge of whatever he finds. If it's looks like sticks and snail shells. And they build these houses that keep them safe and camouflage them. But if you provide them with the substrate you want them to build in, they will also create beautiful pieces of jewelry. So there are several artists that raise caddisflies in containers with precious gems. And the caddisflies will use the substrate as they would if they were in the wild and build houses. And then they pupate and turn into an adult and leave, and they abandon their home. So it's a really sustainable form of jewelry making. I think it's very, very clever. And one of the most important but less flashy functions of caddisflies is that they, in a healthy ecosystem, you should have thousands upon thousands of caddisflies. And they use that silk to bind rocks together. And there's a growing body of literature suggesting that a healthy population of caddisflies might actually change the way a stream flows. So to think about a river and the amount of power the water has during a flood event, or during something traumatic happening, if there's a lot of water moving through, it's a lot of power. And an insect that's less than an inch long has the ability to bind all those rocks and secure everything. It is mind-blowing. I really think it's such a fantastic idea that these tiny insects have the ability to be a keystone species and impact the ecosystem around them. And I think there's a lot of lessons that we can take from caddisflies, aside from the biologic, knowing that working as a community, they can actually improve their stream for the health of other organisms is, I think, really, really fascinating. And that's a big part of why I find them to be such endearing little insects. When they turn into an adult, they're kind of less inspiring. They are a little buffy. They have kind of hairy looking wings, much more like a butterfly or a moth than a stonefly or a mayfly. And they hold their wings they're kind of tinted. And so it's interesting to, I think it's interesting to look at the differences between the older insects, the mayflies and the stoneflies, versus the caddisflies, who are slightly newer on the block. Caddisflies go through a complete metamorphosis, and this might be taking you back to your intro to biology days. So a complete metamorphosis means that they go through a pupal stage. So an adult lays eggs, the eggs hatch into larvae, the larvae pupate, and they often pupate within the protective casing that they build, and then they grow into adults. Some of the older insects, mayflies, stoneflies, damselflies, dragonflies, go through an incomplete metamorphosis where their eggs hatch into larvae, grow into bigger larvae, grow into adults. So it's interesting to kind of look at the different lifestyles of these insects and the different niches that they live in within a stream system. So I talked about the impact of caddisflies, and I would be remiss if I did not talk about the impact of mayflies. So that's my finger for scale, a small dew-covered mayfly. It's hard to imagine that these insects can gather in such large numbers that they register as a weather pattern, but it happens. Mass emergences are really important in the insect world, and I think many people are familiar with the 17-year cicadas mass emergence, where millions and millions and millions of insects seem to just appear all at once, and all of the predators gorge themselves until they can't eat anymore, and that they just keep coming out of the ground. And then they're able to breed safely with the sacrifice of many, many, many insects. The rest are able to reproduce and safely pass on their genes to the next generation. And in a healthy stream community, the same thing happens with mayflies, where all at once, some signal goes out and all of the mayflies turn into their adult form and emerge from the water to breed. So it's kind of a rare occurrence now. It's less rare in certain waterways. But this image is actually taken from Lancaster County in the Susquehanna Basin, where several years ago, there was an unexpected mass emergence of mayflies, and it caused a lot of problems. No one knew it was happening, so they left the lights on the bridge where all the mayflies gathered, and in the morning, there were 3 accidents on the bridge from morning commuters hitting the slick where the insects had died and were unable to control their visitors. So mass emergences can get kind of a bad rap, but it's actually a triumph of restoration efforts that had been taking place for more than a decade before this event happened, because it takes so many resources for these organisms to be able to grow up together at the right time, but it plays such an important role in our ecosystem. But you could imagine waking up to your car looking like this, that maybe you would not appreciate the absolute natural phenomenon of a mass emergence of mayflies. However, it's critical because when there is a mass emergence, there's so much food. The insects breed and then die, which results in an increased nutrient load being applied to the soils and the stream. There's usually increased clutch sizes for frogs and reptiles and birds. It is a hugely important process that happens in our world. And it used to happen regularly, but due to the ongoing trauma our streams have gone through with development and changes to their flow patterns, it's become less common. So if ever you're involved or get to be present during a massive emergence, I hope you can take a second to just marvel at the absolutely bizarre thing you're a part of before you get annoyed that you have to use an ice scraper to clean all of the bugs off of your car. So how can we make sure our streams are healthy? What does a healthy stream look like? This looks like a place I would like to spend time, right? It's got lots of shade, lots of healthy trees, providing cover, dropping leaves into our stream. You can see the bottom. There's good rocks and nooks and crannies and places to hide if I were an insect. That looks like a nice place to be. This is less ideal, but unfortunately, this is what more and more of our streams look like as increased developmental pressures change the way we manage our waterways. So what can we do as individuals to make sure that we can do what we can for our stream communities? One thing that this picture highlights is mowing all the way up to the edge of the waterway is really not ideal. So try, if you have a stream in your backyard, try to leave some buffer space, because as water flows over your yard right into that waterway, it's picking up dirt and detritus and moving really quickly and getting really warm and then just dumping into the water. And that's not really ideal for our stream community. Plant native plants and trees along the waterways and in your yard. It's amazing what a massive impact trees and especially native plants can have. A lot of our native herbaceous plants have really deep and robust root systems, and that allows rainwater to enter and percolate into the soil more effectively than lawn does. And what happens is that when you get a lot of rain, it flows over the land and then hits these nice deep root systems and starts to infiltrate back into the soil, which slows down the rate of overland flow and decreases the amount of pollution and sediment that's being carried into our waterways. Try to avoid using pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers whenever possible. It's poorly understood how many of the pesticides and herbicides interact in our waterways and the impact that it has on our insect communities. There is a lot of research going into getting a better understanding of how all of these additives that we put on our lawn can really negatively impact our waterways. But as we learn more, we learn mostly that it's bad news. So I would avoid using it if possible. And pick up litter or organize a stream cleanup. These small kinds of effects, much like the caddisflies stabilizing the stream, if we all put a little bit of effort in, we can make a really large measurable difference. And I know because you're all here, you're curious about the world that we live in, about these stream insects, and maybe you came here to learn more about which fishing lures you should be using, but that's a talk for another time. Hopefully you were able to take a little bit away from this, and I hope you're curious and you're inspired, and you also have a love for beautiful waterways and the things that live in it. But I hope as you are starting to open your eyes to some of these kind of weird stream creatures, that when you're out in the field or along the waterways, let me know if you see something cool or interesting, because I love seeing things. And typically this time of year, my team and I would be out on the water every day. But given the current circumstances, I only have one pair of eyes. So if you want to explore and, let me know what's going on, that would be fantastic. Because you might run into something unbelievable, like this dragon hunter, this is a dragonfly, and its main source of food is other dragonflies, given its name dragon hunter. Thank you, entomologists. So this was actually found at Ashbridge Preserve at Ridley Creek. There are amazing and diverse and wild creatures living all over the place. We just have to learn how to see them. So that concludes my talk, but I would love to draw your attention to an upcoming talk on June 11th at 7 p.m. where the staff at Rushton Farms celebrates their new season and starts to share how to promote beneficial insects and give gardening advice and update you on the farm. I think it's going to be a fantastic night, so hopefully I'll see you then. So my contact information is at the bottom of the screen, and I would love to open up the floor to any questions that you have. Thank you again so much for joining me and listening to my love song for bugs. And I hope that you learned something today. So, all right, are there any questions? No. Okay. Cool. Thank you for coming, and I hope that you enjoyed the talk.
Lauren?
All right. Yeah, Bill.
Good. Thanks. I don't know how to frame this because it's not so much as a question, maybe as a comment. I thought you did an amazing job explaining, let's say, a healthy stream system as opposed to another system that may be challenged in some way by looking at the diversity of the macroinvertebrates. My question is, when you are analyzing that data, it takes a long time to access the various keys for the various families of organisms that are present in the stream. And you get it down to a species level, and then the sample sits in a jar someplace, probably on some shelf. My question is, couldn't you, let's say, very quickly get to a more generic level, like the family level, for instance. And once you knew your families, you could almost instantaneously come up with a good index number for describing the health of that stream. Do we really need to take it down for our purposes? We aren't writing papers necessarily on the Ephemeroptera or Plecoptera or whatever, but is that something that you think about?
Oh yeah, constantly. You can get a lot of information just from looking at the order or the family level. So kind of that higher level analysis. However, I think the further into detail you go, getting down to the genus and species level really gives you a much more refined understanding. And a great example of this would be if you found in an incredibly disrupted stream, right? You have lots of Chironomidae, so those midges.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're doing restoration efforts, you're not seeing those mayflies and stoneflies come back. However, by looking at the species level at midges, you will see diversity start to build back up at that level. And it is time intensive, and it is a bit of a challenge, but especially when you're doing restoration work, which there's tons happening in our program area, it gives you that sensitivity to be able to say, oh, look, we actually do have sensitive caddisflies starting to return to an area that was degraded. So it is, I think, a balance between time and effort and the question that you want to ask. So we're just starting to get an understanding of our stream reaches at Willistown. So going down to that higher level analysis is really beneficial, I think.
It would seem to me that with this season being challenged the way it is, wouldn't it? I'm wondering if you did the quick and dirty analysis at the family level, let's say, or whatever, the kingdom, phylum, class, order or whatever, to give you that. You remember the index of, say, if you had the Mays index of 13, you said, wow.
Yeah, so this season's a challenge, not because of the analysis, but because of the field work. There's a lot of equipment you've got to haul out to your stream reach, so it is challenging to get out maintaining social distance. So we've canceled our spring sampling with the hope that we can actually go out and collect data in the fall, which would give us a really interesting juxtaposition, because we normally do spring sampling to see how the community changes over the course of the summer. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think that always you want to design your experiment and your data to suit the question that you're asking. So as we're learning more, maybe we'll shift, but for now we're going to keep trying to get that high level analyses that we're working on. Thanks, Bill. All right, it looks like we have some questions in the chat.
Yeah, so Jody's asking, can you talk about the relative health of our local streams in Willistown?
Sure, yeah, so compared to some of the other streams in our area, our streams are looking really good. What's interesting is we started sampling in 2018, right before we started to have intense flooding, which took place in the late spring all the way through probably November. So what we're seeing is a shift in our community structure, not because of degradation, but it seems like it might be a result of changes in flow structure. So a lot of those clinging insects that, might not have been robust enough to withstand the regular flooding that took place in 2018 aren't as present in our samples of 2019, which is interesting. But there hasn't been too much of a change of the presence of some of the better, I guess, clingers that were able to withstand the flooding, who are still sensitive insects. So that was neat. That's the biggest change we've seen. Overall, our area is actually in good shape, considering the amount of development around the springs. Ridley, Crum, and Darby Creek all originate kind of along the 30 corridor, and there's a lot of intensive development in the immediate headwaters. As you move downstream, there's a lot of protected open space, which gives the stream the ability to start to recover a little bit. So it's a really fascinating and kind of backwards layout to what you would expect to see development-wise, where you would have a lot of development where the stream is larger, kind of historically where you would have mills in place, and then increased open space and forested land as you go up towards the headwaters. So overall, I think it looks good. It's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect because there are a lot of people who live here. But compared to some of the more urbanized streams, we are in good condition. All right.
So then there's a little bit of a follow-up along those same lines that Linda's asking about the Delaware Valley, Southeastern PA area more in general, and what streams in that area are more at risk than others.
Well, that is a complicated question, but well, it's a good question with a complicated answer. So the history of Southeastern Pennsylvania is riddled with poor water management. So Pennsylvania is blessed with the highest stream mileage in the country. But in Southeastern Pennsylvania, as the population grew really, really rapidly, a lot of the wetlands that historically existed there were drained, and a lot of the streams were put underground. So if you look at stream maps from the 17 and 1800s and compare it to our stream maps of today, most of the tributaries no longer exist because they've been piped underground. A great example of this is Overbrook. The Overbrook station on the main line. If you get off of that station, you can walk about 200 feet and see exactly where Overbrook got its name from, as the, I think it's called Church Creek, flows right into a tunnel and disappears. And then that stream is piped underground until it feeds into the main stem of the Delaware some miles away. And what happens is the water gets very cold and it runs, there's not oxygen being input into it because it's a smooth stream. So that stream needs a lot of love, but that's not the question you were necessarily asking, I think. But many of the outflows from those piped streams are incredibly degraded. And so you see pockets of decreased health throughout the Delaware where those streams come in and meet and flow into the water. However, our more naturalized streams, you know, it's hard to say because there are so many. But as you get closer to, you know, Philadelphia and, you know, towards John Hines, there's a lot of urban pressure on our waterways, and it's really hard to combat that because, you know, there's an airport and a lot of this massive development that helped us to get to where we are as, you know, a state economically, but it did come at the cost of a lot of the health of our waterways. So Linda, I'm not sure if I really answered your question or just shared a lot of bad news. Let me know if you'd like me to shift the answer to answer something different. All right, it's a great question though. It's a complicated topic, but there are a lot of success stories like Valley Creek. There was a ton of effort put into restoring riparian buffers and the channel, and it resulted in you know, brook trout returning, which is a huge success story. So it is possible, just a challenge. Are there any other questions? All right, well, oh, Bill, yeah, you raised your hand. You're muted. Still muted.
Lauren, I think you can actually unmute him.
I'm trying. It's not letting me unmute you, Bill. Are you?
Wait, here I'm
Oh,
just.
there you are.
I just
Great.
wanted to thank you. I apologize. So learning how to do all this stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a pretty steep learning curve with Zoom, but I think we're all getting there.
Well, thank you a lot.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you all so much for coming
And
out.
You recorded this, right?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all again. Feel free to contact us if you have any questions or anything pops up that occurs to you after this is ended. And I look forward to hopefully doing this again sometime. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks, everyone. You're all the best.